Before the sun rose over Constantinople, the walls were already awake. Not with voices, with dust. Small pieces of stone slipped from the damaged defences, where Ottoman cannon fire had been working for weeks. Mortar loosened. Timber supports groaned. Somewhere near the land walls, men who had slept in fragments took their places again, stepping over broken masonry, baskets of earth, splintered planks, and the quiet evidence of repairs that had not fully held. The city was not silent. It only sounded tired. Beyond the walls, the Ottoman camp stretched across the dark ground like another city built for one purpose. Fires burned low. Horses shifted in the cold hours before dawn. Drums and orders moved through the army of Mehmed II, the young sultan who had come not simply to raid Constantinople, not merely to frighten it, but to take it and make it the center of a new imperial world. Inside the city stood Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of a Roman line that had once claimed the Mediterranean as its political inheritance. In 1453, that inheritance had narrowed into a capital, a few dependent territories, foreign promises, and walls that still carried the reputation of a much larger state. Those walls mattered. The Theodosian walls had resisted armies for centuries. They were not decorative ruins. They were layered defenses of stone, towers, ditches, gates, and human labor. To attackers, they were a problem. To defenders, they were memory made physical. But by the spring of 1453, memory had to be patched at night with earth and timber because bronze cannon had changed the rhythm of siege. The Ottoman siege had begun on April 6. For weeks, the city had endured bombardment, probing attacks, naval pressure, hunger, fear, and the slow grinding routine of damage and repair. A wall section would crack. Men would move forward after dark. They would pack earth behind broken stone, raise barriers, drag beams, carry baskets, and prepare for the next impact. Then the guns would speak again. It was not a single blow. It was repetition. That was the cruelty of the siege. The defenders did not need to fail every day. They only needed to fail once. Mehmed's army could absorb failed attacks, wasted shots, dead men, delays, and frustration. Constantinople could not absorb mistakes in the same way. It had courage. It had experience. It had commanders who understood what was at stake. But it did not have enough bodies to make every weakened point safe forever. Near the most threatened landward defenses, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese commander, had become one of the city's most important military figures. His presence mattered because Constantinople's survival depended not only on imperial dignity, but on practical siege experience. Where to place men, where to reinforce, when to hold, when to move, when panic had to be stopped before it became contagious. A city can appear united from a distance. From inside, unity is work. It is a guard staying awake when his body has stopped believing in rest. It is a mason pushing earth into a damaged section of wall while the smell of powder hangs in the air. It is a priest trying to keep people calm when every heavy sound from outside makes children look toward the doors. It is a commander deciding which part of the wall can survive with fewer men, because there are not enough men for every place that needs them. Imagine one of those repair crews before dawn. Not a hero from a chronicle, not a named nobleman. Just a group of exhausted men moving under orders near broken stone. Their hands are raw from rope, lime, wood, and rubble. Their clothes carry the smell of smoke and sweat. A basket is passed upward. Earth spills over the edge. Someone listens for the next sound from the Ottoman side, because by this point the defenders have learned that silence is not comfort. Silence is preparation. For them, the empire is not an abstract idea. It is the weight of earth in a basket. It is the cold surface of stone against the hand. It is the question of whether the wall they repaired in darkness will still be standing when the light comes. Outside, Mehmed II understood something that many enemies before him had not been able to turn into reality. Constantinople was not only a city to be stormed, it was a system to be exhausted. The walls had to be damaged. The harbor had to be threatened. The defenders had to be stretched. Hope had to be answered quickly whenever it appeared. Every part of the siege pressed on a different part of the city's mind, and the city's mind was already divided. For years, Byzantine leaders had looked westward for help. That help had come with a price. Church union with Rome, a compromise many within Constantinople accepted only under pressure, and many others rejected as a wound to Orthodox faith. So even before Ottoman soldiers reached the walls, the city had been forced to ask whether survival required surrendering part of its spiritual independence. This was one of the bitter facts of the last Byzantine century. The empire could not save itself alone, but the help it needed came through powers it did not fully trust. By May 29, that argument had become almost irrelevant in practical terms. The issue was no longer whether the union had been wise. The issue was whether anyone could hold the defenses through another assault. Constantine XI still carried the title of emperor. But titles do not fill empty ranks. The imperial ceremonies, the old Roman language of rule, the sacred aura of Constantinople, the echo of Justinian and Heraclius and Basil II, all of it still mattered emotionally. It mattered to identity. It mattered to memory. It mattered to the story people told about who they were. But it could not stand watch at every tower. The city was not dying because its people lacked courage. It was dying because courage had been asked to do the work of an empire. That was the hard truth behind the final morning. Constantinople's defenders were not cowards waiting for defeat. Many fought with discipline and desperation. Many understood that, if the city fell, something far larger than a local government would disappear. This was the capital that had preserved Greek learning, Roman law, Christian ritual, imperial ceremony, and 1,000 years of political memory. Its streets carried layers of empire. Its churches held centuries of prayer. Its walls had taught generations of enemies to turn away. Yet, 1453 was not decided by symbolism alone. It was decided by the narrowing gap between what the city represented and what it could still materially defend. Mehmed had men, guns, engineers, ships, ambition, and a state strong enough to keep pressure on the walls. Constantine had a city of immense meaning, a limited garrison, foreign volunteers, fragile morale, and the burden of asking every defender to stand in for provinces that no longer sent enough soldiers and treasuries that no longer held enough coin. This is why the fall of Constantinople cannot be understood as only a dramatic final battle. The final assault matters. The breach matters. The death of the last emperor matters. But the last morning was not created in one night. It was made by centuries of lost territory, broken alliances, religious division, trade dependence, failed rescue, and Ottoman growth. By the time the attack began, the city was carrying more history than resources. Near the walls, the defenders could not see all of that. They saw what was in front of them: smoke, ladders, shields, shattered stone, commanders shouting through noise, and the awful uncertainty of whether the line was still holding somewhere beyond their sight. Inside the churches, people prayed not as an image for later historians, but because prayer was one of the few things still available to them. In Hagia Sophia and smaller churches across the city, candle smoke moved upward into dark spaces, while outside, the old capital waited for a decision made by force. For Mehmed, the morning promised transformation. If Constantinople fell, he would not merely remove an enemy from the middle of Ottoman territory. He would inherit a city whose name could make conquest look like destiny. He would take the Roman capital of the East and turn it into the heart of his own empire. For Constantine, the morning offered no such future. His task was narrower and more terrible: to hold a city that history had made too important to surrender easily, and too weak to defend comfortably. That is where this story begins. Not with a full timeline, not with a list of emperors, not with a clean explanation written after the fact, but with a city before sunrise, standing behind damaged walls while the pressure outside gathered into its final shape. Before we move deeper into the story, remember this. The fall of Constantinople was not just the moment a cannon broke stone. It was the moment a city discovered how much of its greatness had depended on systems that were no longer there. If you want more stories like this, where history is not treated as legend, but as the anatomy of power under pressure, subscribe and follow the next chapter. Because to understand why Constantinople fell on that morning, we have to go back to the reason it had survived so many mornings before. Its first weapon was not a sword. It was geography. Before Constantinople was a legend, it was a location. That sounds too simple for a city wrapped in so much ceremony, theology, imperial memory, and blood. But the first genius of Constantinople was not mystical. It was geographical. Long before the final Ottoman assault, long before the cannon smoke of 1453, the city's power began with water, wind, stone, and the narrow blue throat between continents. The Bosporus was not just a strait, it was a gate. On one side lay Europe, on the other, Asia. To the north, the Black Sea opened toward grain, timber, fur, slaves, fish, and trade routes that reached into the steppe. To the south, the Sea of Marmara led into the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean world. Whoever held this city did not simply occupy land. They watched movement itself. Ships had to pass nearby. Merchants had to calculate its customs. Armies had to respect its position. Diplomats had to understand that Constantinople was not placed at the edge of the world, but at one of its hinges. This was the choice Constantine the Great made in the 4th century. In 330, when he dedicated his new imperial capital, he was not merely decorating an old Greek town with Roman ambition. The older city of Byzantium already possessed a remarkable site, but Constantine gave it imperial scale. He understood what the location could become. A capital easier to defend than Rome, closer to the eastern provinces, positioned between the Danube frontier, the Black Sea, Anatolia, and the great roads of the eastern Mediterranean. A ruler could stand there and feel the map tightening into one point. The city had water on 3 sides. To the north, the Golden Horn formed a deep natural harbor, protected and useful, a place where ships could anchor under the eyes of the capital. To the south, the Sea of Marmara gave another barrier. To the east, the Bosporus controlled passage. Only the western landward side remained open enough for a great army to attack directly, so the city turned that weakness into an answer. The Theodosian walls, built and expanded in the early 5th century, became one of the most formidable defensive systems in the medieval world. They were not a single wall standing proudly against a field. They were a layered arrangement: ditch, outer wall, inner wall, towers, gates, roads behind the defenses, and enough depth to punish an attacker who thought one breach meant victory. This mattered because siege warfare was usually a conversation between patience and supply. Attackers needed time, food, animals, timber, machines, morale, and political will. Defenders needed walls, water, stores, command discipline, and the ability to outlast the men outside. For centuries, Constantinople was built to win that conversation. A guard on the land walls did not need to understand the whole geopolitical system to feel its result. He would know the height of the stone beneath him, the distance to the ditch below, the wind coming across the fields, the sound of boots on the wall walk, and the confidence that came from standing on defenses that had already become part of the city's identity. Behind him lay the capital: markets, churches, cisterns, palace corridors, workshops, warehouses, monasteries, bakeries, docks, and streets that gathered languages from across the eastern Mediterranean. The city's strength was not only in its fortifications. It was in the way its fortifications protected a living system. Near the Golden Horn, a harbour clerk might sit with a wax tablet or parchment recording cargo that had come through the water: grain, oil, wine, cloth, timber, metalwork, spices, fish. Around him, sailors shouted in different accents. Ropes creaked against wood. The smell of salt water mixed with pitch, sweat, damp wool, and old fish. Above the harbour, church bells marked time, while customs officials turned geography into revenue. This is what made the city more than a fortress. A fortress can be strong and still poor. Constantinople was strong because it sat at the crossing of defense and wealth. The same waters that made it difficult to attack helped feed it, tax it, connect it, and give its rulers leverage over worlds that had to move past its shore. And when danger came, the city had another advantage. The Golden Horn could be sealed. A great chain could be stretched across the harbour entrance, blocking hostile ships from entering. In practical terms, it was a defensive device. In visual terms, it was almost perfect. Metal across water, a line between safety and invasion. The city deciding who could enter its protected interior. That image would matter again in 1453. But in earlier centuries, Constantinople had already proved what these defenses could do. The siege of 717 to 718, when the Umayyad Caliphate attempted to take the city, became one of the great tests of Byzantine survival. The attackers brought serious force. The city endured. Its walls, fleet, resources, winter conditions, and political resilience combined to prevent the Eastern Roman capital from falling. The details of that siege belong to another age, but its meaning carried forward. Constantinople learned something about itself. So did its enemies. This was a city that could make conquest expensive. Not impossible. No city is impossible forever. But expensive in money, men, time, morale, and prestige. Many rulers could dream of taking Constantinople. Far fewer could afford to keep dreaming once the siege became long, hungry, wet, and humiliating. That reputation became part of the city's armor. A wall protects with stone. A reputation protects before the first ladder is raised. If attackers believe a city cannot easily be taken, they approach with caution. If defenders believe the same thing, they stand a little longer. The line between material defense and psychological defense becomes hard to separate. For Constantinople, that line held for centuries. But there was a danger hidden inside such success. The very things that made the city feel eternal could make later generations misunderstand what had actually kept it alive. It was tempting to say the city survived because its walls were sacred, or because God favored it, or because Rome could not truly die while Constantinople stood. Those beliefs mattered. They gave meaning. They helped people endure. But the deeper truth was more practical. The city survived because walls, water, ships, tax districts, grain routes, soldiers, engineers, administrators, and political decisions worked together. When that larger system functioned, Constantinople looked almost untouchable. When it weakened, the same city could still look magnificent while becoming more fragile beneath the surface. Constantinople was not saved by walls alone. It was saved by the world that kept those walls alive. That is the central fact hidden behind its grandeur. A wall needs repair. A harbor needs ships. A chain needs men to raise and maintain it. A capital needs provinces that can feed it, pay it, and send soldiers when danger comes. A ruler needs more than ceremony. He needs the administrative reach to make commands become action beyond the palace. For much of Byzantine history, Constantinople had that reach. Imperial officials could draw revenue from provinces. Armies could be organized across regions. Grain and goods could move through networks protected by law, patrols, treaties, and force. The emperor's word did not magically transform the world, but it traveled through institutions that gave it weight. That is why earlier sieges failed. An enemy outside the walls was not facing stone alone. He was facing an imperial system with depth behind it, a city with stored food, a fleet that could act, engineers who could repair, officials who could organize, religious ritual that could unify fear, a population accustomed to the idea that endurance was part of civic identity. The walls were the visible part. The system behind them was the harder thing to see. And because it was harder to see, it was easier to lose slowly. By the time of the last siege, the old relationship between the city and the world behind it had been broken. The walls still stood. The Golden Horn still curved like a protected arm around the harbor. Hagia Sophia still rose above the city, with a presence that could make men feel small. The Bosporus still glittered with the same cold beauty that had made the site irresistible to Constantine. But geography is not loyal by itself. The same strait that once connected Constantinople to wealth could become a channel of isolation if an enemy controlled its shores. The same harbor that once protected the fleet could become a pocket of anxiety if hostile ships found another way in. The same land walls that once faced armies backed by medieval siege engines would, in 1453, face an enemy willing to bring artillery, engineers, manpower, and a state organized enough to keep pressure constant. A city can inherit defenses. It cannot inherit the conditions that once made those defenses decisive. That was the slow tragedy of Constantinople. Its geography remained brilliant, but brilliance is not the same as security. Its walls remained famous, but fame does not repair stone. Its past remained immense, but the past does not send fresh troops from lost provinces. To understand 1453, then, we must resist the easy image of an ancient city simply overwhelmed by a young sultan's cannon. Mehmed II mattered. The cannon mattered. The final assault mattered. But what made the fall possible was that Constantinople had become a fortress whose original advantages had been gradually turned against it. The city at the crossing of continents became a city surrounded by Ottoman lands. The harbor that once brought wealth became a space that had to be defended with fewer ships. The walls that had once expressed imperial confidence became a line held by exhausted men doing the work of vanished provinces. None of this happened in one morning. It took centuries, and one of the deepest wounds came not from an Ottoman army, but from men who marched under the sign of the cross. Because Constantinople's walls could defeat enemies, they could not protect the city from its friends. The danger did not always come from the east. For centuries, Constantinople had watched enemies gather beyond its walls. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Turks. Armies from the frontier, armies from the steppe, armies that arrived with the plain purpose of conquest. Those threats were terrible, but they were understandable. They came as enemies. The Fourth Crusade came wearing the language of rescue. By the beginning of the 13th century, the idea of crusade had already changed the political imagination of Christendom. War could be preached as devotion. Debt could be hidden under vows. Ambition could travel under a cross stitched onto cloth. Men who had never seen Jerusalem could be persuaded that violence, if directed properly, might become holy service. But politics rarely stays inside the words used to bless it. The Crusaders, who eventually reached Constantinople in 1203 and 1204, were not supposed to make the city their great prize. The original aim had been Egypt, a strategic gateway to the Muslim powers controlling Jerusalem. Yet the expedition was entangled from the start with money, transport, Venetian interests, and the dangerous convenience of Byzantine dynastic politics. Venice had built ships for the crusade. Ships cost money. Crews cost money. Food, timber, rope, iron, and time cost money. When the Crusaders could not fully pay what they owed, their spiritual mission became vulnerable to practical creditors. Enrico Dandolo, the aged Doge of Venice, was not simply a background figure. Venetian power depended on trade routes, ports, privileges, and the ability to turn maritime logistics into political leverage. The crusade needed ships. Venice had them. That imbalance mattered. The expedition first turned against Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic, in 1202. That alone revealed how far the crusade had drifted from its original moral language. A campaign meant to fight for the Holy Land had already attacked fellow Christians because debt and strategy had made it useful. Then came Constantinople. The path into Byzantine politics opened through Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II Angelos. He promised money, troops, and church union if the Crusaders helped restore his family to power. To men already burdened by debt and uncertainty, such promises were tempting. They made a detour look like a solution. They made interference in Constantinople look temporary. On paper, it could be described as dynastic restoration. On the ground, it put an armed Latin force outside the walls of the greatest Christian city in the East. In 1203, the Crusaders helped install Isaac II and his son Alexios IV. But promises are easier to make in exile than to fulfill from a resentful capital. Constantinople did not have limitless treasure waiting to satisfy foreign soldiers. The population did not welcome Latin pressure. The court was unstable. Anti-Latin feeling ran deep, sharpened by earlier tensions over trade privileges, religious rivalry, and the presence of Western merchants inside Byzantine economic life. The arrangement quickly turned poisonous. Alexios IV could not deliver enough. The Crusaders would not leave empty-handed. Byzantine factions moved against him. In early 1204, he was overthrown and killed after Alexios V Doukas took power. The city now faced crusaders who believed they had been cheated, Venetians with commercial aims, and leaders who could turn outrage into permission. By April 1204, Constantinople was attacked. This time the enemy knew the city's wealth, its churches, its palaces, its relics, and its divisions. They were not distant invaders imagining a prize. They were men who had already been close enough to smell the harbor, study the walls, count the towers, and understand that the capital was not merely a fortress, but a treasury of centuries. The assault succeeded, and then came the sack. No reconstruction of that violence should pretend to know every private moment. Chronicles from the period carry anger, justification, shock, religious bias, and later memory. But the broad fact is not in doubt. Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christendom, was looted by Western Crusaders in April 1204. Churches were stripped, palaces were plundered, relics were taken, works of art were broken, melted, carried away, or redistributed into new contexts. Horses, bronze, gold, silver, silk, manuscripts, icons, ceremonial objects, and sacred containers became spoils in a city that had once imagined itself protected not only by walls, but by its place in Christian history. In a monastery or church, the event would not have felt like a geopolitical transition. It would have felt like hands-on objects that had never been meant for plunder. A monk might see wax running down beside a disturbed altar. He might hear boots where there should have been chanting, metal striking wood, hurried voices in languages that sounded familiar enough to be disturbing and foreign enough to be frightening. A reliquary could be opened not with reverence, but with calculation. A manuscript might be pushed aside because its value could not be weighed quickly. Dust could rise from a shelf where prayer, learning, and imperial patronage had rested for generations. That is how a system becomes personal. Not as the fall of a city, but as a hand reaching for a sacred vessel. Not as the collapse of imperial authority, but as a door broken in a place where people believed sanctuary still meant something. The sack of 1204 did not simply remove wealth. It changed the emotional map of Byzantine politics. After that, appeals to Western Christendom would never be clean again. They could still be necessary. They could still be practical. Byzantine emperors could still negotiate with popes, Venetians, Genoese, kings, and crusading courts. But after 1204, necessity came with humiliation. The deepest wound was not that Constantinople had been conquered. It was that it had been conquered by people who claimed to share its God. That wound would last. The Latin Empire was established in Constantinople after the sack, but it never possessed the full legitimacy, reach, or stability of the Byzantine state it replaced. Greek successor states formed elsewhere, most importantly the Empire of Nicaea, along with Epirus and Trebizond. These were not footnotes. They were fragments of a broken political world trying to preserve claims, institutions, families, church identity, and imperial continuity outside the captured capital. For decades, the old empire existed as a memory divided among competing centers. Nicaea became the most successful of these successor states. It held enough structure, leadership, and military capacity to keep the Byzantine claim alive. But keeping a claim alive is not the same as keeping the old world intact. Every year outside Constantinople changed the balance of power. Every negotiation with Italian maritime states exposed dependence. Every rivalry among Greek successor regimes spent energy that could not be used to rebuild a unified imperial base. In 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos recovered Constantinople. The event was dramatic, and in ceremonial terms it mattered enormously. The emperor returned. The Latin occupation ended. Byzantine rule was restored in the capital. To later eyes, this can look like a resurrection. But resurrection is a dangerous word in politics. The city Michael VIII entered was not the city before 1204. Its population, wealth, buildings, defenses, and international position had all been marked by decades of occupation and fragmentation. The empire that returned to Constantinople had to defend the symbolism of the old capital while ruling from a narrower material base. This created a problem that would haunt the final centuries. The restored Byzantine state needed the capital because Constantinople gave legitimacy. Without it, the emperor's claim felt incomplete. Yet holding the capital also required money, soldiers, walls, diplomacy, ships, and administrative reach. The prize that gave the empire meaning also demanded resources the empire struggled to provide. That tension did not destroy Constantinople immediately. History rarely works that neatly. The Palaiologan emperors after 1261 were not fools simply waiting for disaster. They negotiated, fought, married, conceded, maneuvered, and tried to survive among stronger neighbors and unreliable allies. They inherited a capital that had to be defended not only from external enemies, but from the consequences of its own symbolic weight. And the world around them was changing. Italian merchants remained powerful in the eastern Mediterranean. Venice and Genoa competed for privilege, profit, and access. The Byzantine emperors needed naval support and commercial relationships, but every concession made survival easier in the short term while reducing independence in the long term. Across Anatolia, Turkish principalities rose in territories that had once formed the empire's recruitment and tax base. In the Balkans, rival powers pressed from different directions. The restored empire had a capital. What it lacked was the old depth behind the capital. That is why 1204 belongs inside the story of 1453. The Ottoman cannon did not strike a city untouched by previous catastrophe. It struck a city whose wealth had been drained, whose trust in Western rescue had been corrupted, whose political continuity had been fractured, and whose recovered capital carried more meaning than the state could comfortably sustain. By the 15th century, when Byzantine emperors again looked westward for help, the memory of 1204 remained like a warning written underneath every promise. Rome might offer union. Venice might offer ships. Genoese captains might defend the walls. Latin soldiers might stand beside Greeks in the final siege. But the wound had taught Constantinople to doubt the hand extended toward it. That doubt would matter when survival required trust. After 1261, the city could still perform empire. It could crown emperors, hold liturgies, receive envoys, guard relics, and speak in the old language of Roman continuity. The ceremonies returned because ceremonies are often the easiest part of power to restore. The harder parts were less visible. Tax districts had to function. Harbors had to produce revenue. Armies had to be paid. Walls had to be repaired. Provinces had to obey. Allies had to arrive when called. A capital could be recovered by a bold stroke, but a durable empire had to be rebuilt through repeated material success. That was the challenge after 1261. Constantinople had survived its first fall and returned to Byzantine hands, but survival had left scars in stone, treasury, diplomacy, and memory. The city still looked like the center of an ancient world. Beneath that image, the foundations had shifted. The next problem would be quieter than sack and flame. It would appear in trade documents, harbor privileges, missing tax revenue, foreign merchant quarters, shrinking provinces, and rulers forced to negotiate from weakness, while pretending the imperial voice still carried its old weight. Constantinople had been recovered. Now it had to live as a restored capital with a state that no longer matched its ceremonies. When Constantinople returned to Byzantine hands in 1261, the city could still perform the gestures of empire. An emperor could enter. A procession could move through the streets. Prayers could rise beneath domes blackened by age, smoke, and memory. Officials could unfold ceremonial language that made the recovery sound like the correction of history, as if the Latin occupation had been a nightmare and the old order had simply awakened from it. But cities do not become whole because ceremonies say they are whole. Michael VIII Palaiologos had achieved something extraordinary. In 1261, his forces recovered Constantinople from the Latin Empire and restored Byzantine rule in the ancient capital. For the legitimacy of the imperial office, this mattered immensely. The emperor who held Constantinople could claim a depth of authority that no exile court could fully imitate. The city was not just a place, it was proof that the Roman imperial line had not ended, proof that the Church of the East had not been permanently humiliated, proof that the capital taken by Crusaders could be reclaimed by Greeks, proof that the old story still had breath in it. And yet, if a clerk had opened the accounts, if a tax official had compared expectations with revenue, if a commander had counted available men instead of ceremonial titles, the truth would have looked much colder. The empire had returned to its capital with a smaller body. That was the problem of the Palaiologan age. Constantinople gave the restored state prestige, but prestige came with expenses. The walls needed repair, the court needed funding. The churches, palaces, docks, gates, and administrative offices had to function. Envoys had to be received, soldiers had to be paid, ships had to be maintained or hired. Diplomacy had to be performed in a world where everyone understood that the restored empire was weaker than the language it used about itself. A capital is not only a symbol, it is a bill. And after 1261, Byzantium struggled to pay it. The first issue was geography without depth. Constantinople still sat magnificently between the Bosporus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara. But the lands that once fed its strength were slipping away or already gone. In Anatolia, Turkish principalities were growing across territories that had once supplied soldiers, taxes, horses, grain, and strategic space. In the Balkans, rival powers pressed against Byzantine interests. The restored state could still negotiate, but it was increasingly negotiating from a shrinking base. This mattered more than any ceremonial weakness. When an empire loses territory, the loss does not remain on a map. It enters the treasury. It enters recruitment. It enters roads that are no longer safe, farms that no longer pay taxes, villages that no longer send sons to serve, and commanders who must defend more with less. A province lost far from the capital eventually appears as an empty place on a payroll. Inside Constantinople, that reality could be hidden for a while. The city still had its skyline. Hagia Sophia still dominated the urban imagination. Imperial ritual still carried the weight of centuries. Foreign envoys still had to treat the emperor with a certain formal respect, because titles can outlive the force that once made them dangerous. But in the harbour, the imbalance was harder to disguise. The Italian maritime powers had become essential. Genoa and Venice were not simply outside merchants appearing at Byzantine docks. They were political actors with fleets, credit, trading networks, and their own neighborhoods of influence. Their ships could help. Their rivalries could be exploited. Their privileges could be negotiated. But every deal carried a price. In 1261, before the recovery of the capital, the Treaty of Nymphaeum had granted Genoa major commercial privileges in exchange for support against the Latin Empire and Venice. The treaty made sense in the emergency logic of the moment. Michael VIII needed allies. Genoa wanted access and advantage. Both sides saw opportunity. On paper, the arrangement was practical. In the harbour, it meant something more lasting. A customs official working near the Golden Horn might not describe the matter in grand political language. He would see seals, exemptions, cargo lists, disputed fees, foreign merchants protected by agreements written above his station. He might hear Genoese voices from Pera across the water. Smell tar and salt from ships that did not belong to the emperor, and watch profit move through a city whose ruler no longer controlled all the channels of its wealth. The ledger would tell the story quietly. A cargo arrives. A privilege applied. A fee is reduced, avoided, redirected, contested. To the court, these were diplomatic arrangements. To the man recording them, they were small daily reminders that survival had been purchased by giving away pieces of control. That is how dependence enters a state. Not always through conquest. Sometimes it enters through signatures, exemptions, harbour rights, and the repeated argument that there is no better option. The Genoese settlement at Galata or Pera, across the Golden Horn, became one of the most visible signs of this reality. It was close enough to be part of the city's commercial life, but distinct enough to remind everyone that power in Constantinople was no longer contained inside imperial walls. Across the water stood a foreign commercial community with its own interests, fortifications, and calculations. For a restored emperor, this was both useful and humiliating. Useful because Byzantine rulers needed ships, trade, credit, and diplomatic channels. Humiliating because the capital's own waters now reflected the influence of outsiders who could not simply be commanded like subjects of an earlier age. Michael VIII and his successors tried to maneuver through this world. They were not passive. They used marriage diplomacy, church negotiations, alliances, rivalries between Genoa and Venice, and careful balancing between stronger neighbors. At times, Byzantine diplomacy remained impressively skilled. But skill cannot erase arithmetic. The state had fewer resources than its obligations required. A restored court had to behave like an empire while governing a much smaller reality. It had to defend Constantinople, manage enemies, bargain with Italian powers, watch the Balkans respond to Anatolia, and preserve religious legitimacy among people who already remembered the catastrophe of 1204. The emperor's position became increasingly paradoxical. He needed the capital to appear legitimate, But the capital drained resources. He needed foreign merchants to sustain trade. But foreign privileges weakened his control. He needed Western help against Eastern threats. But Western help revived religious and political suspicion. He needed to maintain imperial dignity. But dignity itself became expensive. The restored empire had recovered Constantinople, but it had not recovered the world that made Constantinople powerful. That was the quiet trap after 1261. Not immediate disaster. Not one fatal decision. A narrowing corridor of choices. The Palaeologan rulers lived in that corridor for generations. Each crisis demanded improvisation. Each improvisation solved something briefly while exposing a deeper weakness. Grant a privilege and buy support. Accept foreign help and invite resentment. Negotiate church union and create outrage at home. Shift troops to one front and expose another. Hold the capital and spend what little strength remains proving that the capital can still be held. The tragedy is that many of these choices were understandable. A ruler with a weak navy cannot pretend maritime allies are unnecessary. A state surrounded by stronger enemies cannot refuse diplomacy because it feels humiliating. A city with ancient walls still has to repair them, even if the treasury is thin. Survival often forces governments to choose not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. The Palaeologan emperors chose survival again and again, but survival is not the same as recovery. By the 14th century, the Byzantine state was increasingly entangled in civil wars, regional pressures, and dependence on forces beyond its control. Serbian expansion under Stefan Dusan, Bulgarian pressure, Turkish advances, Latin commercial interests, internal aristocratic rivalries, and dynastic disputes all contributed to a world in which Constantinople's imperial claim became harder to translate into action. Across Anatolia, the frontier had changed beyond recognition. The old Byzantine military and fiscal structures that had once supported the capital were no longer intact. Turkish beyliks rose where imperial authority had thinned. Among them, the Ottomans would become the most consequential. Their early growth did not at first look like the inevitable rise of a world empire. It looked like one frontier power among others. But the pattern was dangerous. Where Byzantine power retreated, new powers organized. Where imperial tax collection failed, other rulers collected. Where old roads lost protection, other military systems learned the terrain. Where Constantinople remembered its past, its rivals built futures from the ground under their feet. This is the part of imperial decline that rarely looks cinematic. It is not always a burning palace. It is a missing tax district. It is a delayed payment. It is a fortress not repaired this year because another emergency is more urgent. It is a commander writing for reinforcements that cannot be spared. It is a merchant realizing the safest route now depends on someone else's flag. From the outside, Constantinople still appeared magnificent enough to attract envy. From the inside, its rulers knew that magnificence could not be converted easily into soldiers. That gap shaped everything that followed. When later emperors looked westward, they were not doing so because they loved surrendering religious independence. They did it because the material situation kept pushing them toward compromise. When they tolerated Italian influence, it was not because they enjoyed dependence. They did it because the city needed maritime connections. When they kept performing imperial ceremony, it was not only vanity. Ceremony was one of the few tools left to remind allies, subjects, rivals, and themselves that the Roman claim still existed. But claims require enforcement. By the time Ottoman strength began tightening around Constantinople, the old capital had become a place of extraordinary meaning and limited leverage. It could still inspire devotion. It could still frighten rulers who understood its symbolic value. It could still matter deeply to Christians, Muslims, merchants, scholars, and emperors. What it could no longer do was command the surrounding world as it once had. Across the Golden Horn, Galata watched and traded. Across the Bosporus, Ottoman power grew. Across the sea, Western rulers listened, calculated, delayed, promised, argued, and often failed to act in time. And inside Constantinople, the restored empire continued to perform an old role on a stage whose foundations had been shrinking for generations. The next pressure would not arrive all at once. It would gather slowly, town by town, road by road, fortress by fortress, until the city that once stood at the center of movement found itself surrounded by a younger power, learning how to turn geography into a noose. A siege does not always begin when the first cannon fires. Sometimes it begins when the roads change hands. Long before April 1453, Constantinople had already begun to feel the world around it closing. Not as one dramatic event, not as a single army appearing overnight. The pressure came more slowly than that, through lost towns, shifting borders, broken routes, frontier raids, new tax collectors, and the steady rise of a power that understood how to make geography serve ambition. The Ottomans did not appear from nowhere. They emerged from the fractured frontier world of northwestern Anatolia, where the old Byzantine edge had weakened and Turkish principalities competed, raided, negotiated, and expanded. In that landscape, authority was practical before it was ceremonial. A ruler mattered if he could reward warriors, hold fortresses, gather revenue, protect followers, and keep momentum alive. The early Ottoman beylik did those things well. Osman, the dynasty's founder, became associated with frontier warfare against Byzantine territories. His successors turned frontier opportunity into structure. By 1326, Bursa had fallen and became an early Ottoman capital. That mattered because Bursa was not just a prize. It was a base, a city with administrative value, economic weight, and a position from which further expansion could be organized. Then came the crossing into Europe. In the mid-14th century, the Ottomans gained a foothold at Gallipoli, helped by the chaos of Byzantine civil conflict and the vulnerability of the Dardanelles. Once they crossed into the Balkans, the political meaning of Constantinople changed. The city was no longer simply facing danger from Asia. It was becoming trapped between Ottoman-held or Ottoman-influenced spaces on multiple sides. This was the slow transformation that Byzantine rulers feared but could not reverse. The capital still looked outward over water and walls. But beyond those waters and roads, Ottoman power was learning to stand permanently. It was no longer only a raiding force at the edge of Byzantine territory. It was becoming a state with capitals, armies, commanders, tax systems, and strategic patience. Adrianople, Edirne, became crucial. When the Ottomans took control of Adrianople in the 14th century and made it a major center, they gained a European base from which Constantinople could be watched, pressured, and eventually surrounded. For Byzantine eyes, this was deeply unsettling. The imperial capital had once used geography to command movement between worlds. Now an Ottoman capital in Europe showed that the younger power had crossed the old boundary and made itself at home. A refugee road tells this story better than a court document. Picture a family moving toward Constantinople after another frontier district has become unsafe. Their clothing is damp from rain. A bundle of household goods is tied with rope. Someone carries an icon wrapped in cloth, not because it is valuable in the market, but because leaving it behind would feel like surrendering a piece of home. The road is muddy. News travels faster than certainty. A village has changed hands. A fortress has surrendered. A tax collector speaks for a different lord. No one knows which rumor is true, but everyone understands the direction of fear. For people like that, Ottoman expansion was not an arrow on a map. It was the moment the familiar road stopped feeling familiar. Constantinople received such pressure in fragments. Refugees, merchants, soldiers, clerics, and envoys carried reports from places where imperial authority had once meant something more than memory. Each report made the city's world smaller. A lost town meant less revenue. A threatened road meant higher prices. A defeated army meant fewer hopes. A new Ottoman base meant the next crisis would begin closer to the walls. The Byzantine court could still negotiate. It could still use diplomacy, marriage ties, tribute, appeals to the West, and rivalries among neighboring powers. But the field of action narrowed. The emperor's choices increasingly resembled postponement rather than recovery. A treaty might buy time. A payment might delay attack. A Western promise might lift morale for a season. Yet the underlying direction remained difficult to alter. Ottoman strength was becoming local, permanent, and organized around Constantinople's weakness. There were moments when the Ottoman rise seemed vulnerable. The defeat of Bayezid I by Timur at Ankara in 1402 disrupted Ottoman power and threw the dynasty into crisis. For Constantinople, this offered relief. The pressure eased. The city breathed again. Byzantine diplomacy took advantage of the Ottoman interregnum where it could. But relief is not reversal. The Ottoman state eventually reassembled itself, and when it did, the strategic problem returned with sharper edges. By the time Murad II ruled, Constantinople was no longer dealing with a temporary frontier threat. Murad II was a serious Ottoman ruler, balancing dangers in Anatolia, the Balkans, and within his own political world. In 1422, he besieged Constantinople. The city survived that attack, but survival did not mean safety. The siege showed that Ottoman pressure could now reach the capital directly, and that the old city's future depended less on whether enemies wanted it, and more on whether one of them could finally commit the resources needed to take it. The defenders in 1422 did what Constantinople had done many times before. They endured. But endurance had changed character. In earlier centuries, survival could mean that a great external threat had failed, and the empire behind the walls still had room to recover. By the 15th century, survival often meant only that the final crisis had been delayed. The city was still there, but the Ottoman world around it had not disappeared. It waited. It adapted. It returned. That is why the failures of Western crusading mattered so much. In 1396, at Nicopolis, a crusading army was defeated by the Ottomans. The battle was a warning that Western chivalric confidence could break against Ottoman discipline and command. Then, in 1444, the Crusade of Varna ended in disaster when forces led by King Władysław III of Poland and Hungary and John Hunyadi failed to stop Murad II. The defeat at Varna did not only kill men on a battlefield, it damaged the credibility of the idea that Western Europe could quickly and decisively rescue Constantinople when the final danger came. From Constantinople, these events must have felt like doors closing at a distance. The city needed the West to be strong enough, united enough, and urgent enough. But Western rulers had their own wars, rivalries, finances, fears, and calculations. Papal calls could be powerful in language, but armies required money, transport, political agreement, and time. Constantinople's problem was that Ottoman pressure was nearby and continuous, while Western rescue was distant and uncertain. That imbalance became one of the defining realities of the last Byzantine years. A soldier on the wall did not care how elegant a promise sounded in Rome, Venice, or Buda. He needed men beside him. He needed food in storehouses. He needed ships in the harbor. He needed commanders who could hold the line when ladders rose. Diplomacy mattered only if it arrived in material form before the wall broke. The Ottomans, by contrast, were building material proximity. Their power was not theoretical. It was visible in garrisons, roads, tribute networks, cavalry, infantry, fortresses, and command centers. The court at Edirne was close enough to Constantinople to turn imperial anxiety into a regular condition. Byzantine rulers could no longer imagine danger as something that had to travel across great distances. Danger now lived nearby. This is what made the Ottoman ring so effective. It did not need to strangle the city in one gesture. It only had to reduce Constantinople's options until every solution depended on someone else. The Byzantines needed Italian ships. They needed papal support. They needed Hungarian pressure on the Balkans. They needed Ottoman internal conflict. They needed time. They needed luck. The Ottomans needed Constantinople to remain isolated, and isolation was becoming the natural result of the map. Constantinople was not surrounded in 1453. It had been surrounded by a century of shrinking choices. That was the reality Mehmed II would inherit. When he returned to power in 1451, he did not have to invent the strategic problem from nothing. His predecessors had already pushed Ottoman power into the Balkans, secured major bases, tested the city, survived crises, and made Constantinople increasingly dependent on fragile external support. What Mehmed brought was a sharper concentration of will. He looked at the same city earlier sultans had threatened and saw not merely a target, but an interruption. Constantinople sat in the middle of Ottoman communications between Europe and Asia. It was a Christian imperial capital inside a growing Muslim imperial geography. It carried prestige so great that leaving it unconquered made Ottoman power look incomplete. It could serve as a diplomatic nuisance, a symbolic rival, and a possible doorway for Western intervention. To Mehmed, the city was not only old, it was inconvenient. That made it dangerous. The Byzantine court understood enough to fear him. Constantine XI, who became emperor in 1449, inherited not an open field of choices, but a city whose survival required careful balancing. He could not defeat the Ottomans in open war. He could not fully trust the West. He could not ignore the church union question. He could not conjure soldiers from provinces the empire no longer controlled. He could only maneuver, and maneuvering is hardest when the space around you is disappearing. By the early 1450s, Constantinople was still standing, but the strategic environment had turned against everything that once made it powerful. The Bosporus, once a channel of wealth and movement, was becoming a line of vulnerability. The land routes were watched. The Balkans were no longer a dependable buffer. Anatolia had long ceased to be the imperial reservoir it once was. The West might sympathize, argue, promise, and delay, but no great army stood ready at the walls. The city had survived many enemies because it had once stood at the center of a working imperial system. Now it stood at the center of Ottoman ambition. And while Constantinople debated theology, searched for allies, counted defenders, and repaired old walls, Mehmed II prepared to do something more decisive than another temporary siege. He would not simply bring an army. He would first close the throat of the city itself. The last card Constantinople could play was not an army. It was a prayer written like a treaty. By the 15th century, Byzantine rulers understood that the city could not survive alone if the Ottomans committed fully to conquest. The walls were still formidable. The defenders could still fight. The city still carried a prestige that made its fall unthinkable to many Christians. But prestige did not move soldiers across the sea. It did not pay fleets. It did not force Hungary, Venice, Genoa, the papacy, and other Western powers to act with one will. So the emperors turned to the one language that might still make the West listen: church union. For centuries, the churches of Rome and Constantinople had been divided by theology, authority, ritual, language, politics, and memory. The split was not a single clean wound. It had been widened by disputes over papal authority, the filioque clause, liturgical customs, cultural contempt, commercial rivalry, and the bitter experience of 1204. To many Byzantines, the Latin West was not simply a distant branch of the same faith. It was also the world that had once entered Constantinople as a crusading ally and left it stripped. Yet need has a way of reopening doors that pride would rather keep shut. John VIII Palaiologos, Constantine XI's older brother and predecessor, chose the path of negotiation. He traveled west with bishops, theologians, officials, and hopes that were larger than his leverage. The council first met at Ferrara and later moved to Florence. There, in 1438 and 1439, the Greek delegation entered a world where theological language and political desperation sat at the same table. The issue was presented as unity, but unity meant different things to different men. For the papacy, union promised the healing of schism and the restoration of Roman authority in the eyes of the Eastern Church. For Western rulers, it could turn aid to Byzantium into a religiously meaningful project. For the Byzantine emperor, it was the possible price of military rescue. For many Greek clergy and ordinary believers, it looked like surrender under pressure. That is why the Council of Florence cannot be treated as a simple theological event. It was also a negotiation conducted under the shadow of Ottoman expansion. The Greeks did not arrive as equals in material terms. They arrived from a state that needed help. Their capital was endangered. Their resources were thin. Their diplomatic room was shrinking. This imbalance shaped everything. The arguments over doctrine were real, but so was the knowledge that refusing compromise might leave Constantinople alone before the Ottoman army. On July 6, 1439, the Decree of Union, Laetenter Caeli, was proclaimed. The document announced reconciliation between the Greek and Latin churches. It gave the council a triumphant language. It suggested that old divisions could be healed, that Christendom might stand together, that Constantinople might still be saved through a restored spiritual order. But decrees traveled differently from belief. When the Byzantine delegation returned east, the union met fierce resistance. Many in Constantinople saw it not as healing, but as capitulation. Mark of Ephesus, who refused to sign, became one of the great voices of opposition. His stance mattered because it gave resistance a recognizable figure. A bishop who could say that survival bought at the price of orthodox truth was not salvation. For those who opposed the union, the issue was not abstract stubbornness. The memory of 1204 remained alive. Latin promises did not sound innocent in a city whose churches had once been looted by crusaders. Papal authority did not feel like a neutral theological matter when acceptance of Rome appeared tied to military necessity. The question was not only what doctrine said, it was who had the right to define obedience when a city was afraid. Inside Constantinople, this tension entered ordinary religious life. Imagine a priest preparing liturgy under candle smoke in a neighborhood church. The stone is cold beneath his feet. Wax gathers at the base of candles. Outside, merchants argue over prices. Soldiers pass through narrow streets, and news from the frontier arrives in pieces. He knows what the emperor needs. He knows what Rome has demanded. He knows what many people in front of him fear. The words of worship are no longer only words of worship. They carry diplomacy. They carry suspicion. They carry the question of whether the city can remain itself while begging others to save it. A woman standing in that church may not understand every theological clause debated at Florence. She may never have heard the Latin arguments in full. But she can understand humiliation. She can understand the fear that her children might live under Ottoman rule. She can understand the anger of being told that rescue requires accepting the authority of men whose predecessors had failed Constantinople before. This is where elite diplomacy reached the streets. A treaty written in polished language became a pressure inside candles, sermons, rumors, and confessions. By the time Constantine XI came to power in 1449, the union remained politically necessary and spiritually divisive. He needed Western help. He could not simply reject the policy his brother had pursued, because the strategic situation had only grown worse. But every step toward Rome risked deepening distrust among his own people. The emperor faced a cruel arithmetic. Without Western aid, Constantinople might not survive an Ottoman siege. With Western aid, or even the promise of it, he had to keep alive a church union that many of his subjects hated. The city needed unity at the very moment its main diplomatic strategy produced division. In December 1452, only months before the final siege, a unionist liturgy was celebrated in Hagia Sophia, in the presence of Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate. This was meant to make the union visible inside the city's greatest church. It was meant to show that Constantinople and Rome had been reconciled. But visibility is not the same as acceptance. For supporters, the ceremony represented the last possible bridge to Western rescue. For opponents, it confirmed their fear that imperial survival had been purchased by submission. Hagia Sophia, the spiritual heart of the city, became a space where salvation and betrayal could be imagined at the same time. That ambiguity mattered because morale is not only military. Morale lives in what people believe they are defending. If defenders think they stand for their city, their faith, their families, and their inherited world, they can endure extraordinary pressure. But if the meaning of that defense becomes contested, if one group sees the emperor's policy as necessity, while another sees it as compromise with spiritual danger. Then the city enters the siege already carrying an internal fracture. This does not mean Constantinople fell because people argued about theology. That would be too simple. The city fell because Ottoman pressure, Byzantine weakness, artillery, manpower imbalance, naval isolation, and failed rescue converged. But religious division shaped the atmosphere inside the walls. It made Western help politically costly. It made every promise from Rome feel double-edged. It made the question of survival inseparable from the question of identity. Constantinople needed the West to save its body, but many inside the city feared the price would wound its soul. That was the tragedy of the Union. It was not foolish to seek help. The Byzantine emperors were not choosing humiliation out of vanity. They were looking at the map, the treasury, the armies, and the Ottoman ring tightening around them. They knew that a city with too few defenders could not afford theological purity, if that purity meant military abandonment. But their critics were not simply irrational either. They remembered that Western armies had once turned sacred language into plunder. They feared that papal authority would reduce their church to a conquered institution. They believed that surrendering doctrine under pressure might save walls while destroying the meaning of what those walls protected. Both fears could be understood. That is what made the situation so difficult. By early 1453, the promised Western assistance remained limited. Some Genoese and Venetian help would matter. Giovanni Giustiniani's arrival was genuinely important for the defense. Italian ships and sailors would play roles in the siege, but no overwhelming Western crusading army appeared to break Ottoman pressure before it became fatal. The Union had cost Constantinople internal peace. It had not bought enough external power. In practical terms, this was devastating. The emperor had accepted the political burden of union without receiving the decisive military result that might have justified it. The city was left in the worst middle ground, too compromised for many Orthodox believers, too weakly supported by the West, too exposed to ignore the Ottomans, and too proud to surrender its inherited role easily. A decision made in council chambers became a burden carried by people who would never sit in those chambers. The clergy had to explain it. The emperor had to defend it. The people had to live under its uncertainty. And outside the city, Mehmed II did not need to solve the theological dispute. He only needed to understand that Constantinople's need for Western aid had failed to produce a unified Christian response. For him, that was enough. A divided enemy behind old walls was still dangerous, but less dangerous than a united Christendom moving with speed and force. The Union gave Constantinople a diplomatic hope. It also revealed how little time hope had left. While the city argued over Rome, authority, doctrine, betrayal, necessity, and salvation, a young Ottoman sultan was preparing an answer in a different language. Not parchment, not council decrees, not theological formulas, stone, timber, gun. A fortress rising above the Bosporus, built to make sure that whatever help Constantinople prayed for would have to pass under Ottoman eyes first. Mehmed II did not answer Constantinople's prayers with an argument. He answered them with stone. In 1451, when Mehmed returned to the Ottoman throne, many people around him could still remember his first brief reign as a boy. He had been young, untested, and surrounded by older men who understood how dangerous ambition could be when it outran preparation. Some in the Ottoman elite had reason to prefer caution. Constantinople had tempted rulers before. A failed siege could drain money, kill men, damage prestige, and invite Christian counterattack. Mehmed was not blind to that danger. But he saw Constantinople differently from men who treated it as a difficult prize to be delayed. The city sat between Ottoman Asia and Ottoman Europe like an old lock in a new door. It interrupted communications. It offered a possible landing point for Western intervention. It carried a Roman and Christian prestige that made Ottoman power look incomplete as long as the city remained outside its control. To leave Constantinople standing was not simply to tolerate a weak neighbor. It was to accept a symbol of resistance in the center of Ottoman geography. So Mehmed began where serious conquerors often begin. Not with the final assault, but with the conditions that would make the final assault possible. The Bosporus was the key. For centuries, Constantinople's position on the strait had been one of its great advantages. Ships moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean passed near the city. Supplies, grain, merchants, envoys, rumors, and military aid could all move through water. Even when the empire behind Constantinople shrank, the strait still offered connection. Mehmed intended to make that connection conditional. In 1452, he ordered the construction of Rumeli Hisari on the European side of the Bosporus, opposite the older Anadolu Hisari built on the Asian side under Bayezid the Lucchese, was deliberate. At one of the narrowest points of the strait, the new fortress would allow Ottoman guns to command passing ships. Its later name, Boğazkesim, carried a brutal clarity: the cutter of the strait, or the cutter of the throat. The message was physical. Constantinople could debate Rome and Florence. It could send embassies. It could hope for Venice, Genoa, the papacy, or Hungary. But any help moving through the Bosporus now had to pass beneath Ottoman control. The construction itself was an act of pressure. Stone rose quickly above the water. Laborers, soldiers, masons, engineers, and commanders turned the shoreline into a statement. The fortress did not need to be beautiful. It needed to be useful. Towers climbed. Walls thickened. Timber scaffolds creaked under the work. Boats moved materials along the shore. Men sweated in the summer air while Constantinople watched a new reality being built in plain sight. For Constantine XI, the meaning was obvious. He could protest. He could send messages. He could warn that the fortress threatened the city's lifelines. But protest is only as strong as the force behind it. And by 1452, the Byzantine emperor had little force to make Mehmed stop. The old capital could object to the construction of the knife, but it could not remove the hand that held it. A shipmaster passing through the Bosporus that year would have understood the change more immediately than any theologian. He might stand on deck in damp wind, watching the new Ottoman walls rise above the water. The strait that once felt like a passage now felt like a checkpoint. Men on shore watched the ships. Orders could come from guns, not from treaties. The smell of salt and pitch remained the same. The current still pulled against the hull. Gulls still moved over the water, but the political meaning of the route had changed. A merchant could read that meaning without reading a decree. Sail carefully, pay attention. The water is no longer neutral. In late 1452, the danger became explicit. Accounts describe a Venetian vessel that attempted to pass without obeying Ottoman demands and was fired upon. The ship was taken and its captain was executed. The details vary in the sources, but the political signal was unmistakable. Mehmed was not building a decorative fortress. He was enforcing a new order on the strait before the siege had formally begun. For Constantinople, this was a quiet disaster. The city's defenders could still look at their walls and feel some confidence. The Theodosian defenses remained formidable, but a siege is not only fought where ladders touch stone. It is fought through supply, timing, morale, and the ability to bring help where it is needed. By controlling the Bosporus, Mehmed narrowed the city's options before his army ever camped outside the land walls. Mehmed did not begin the conquest by attacking Constantinople. He began by making Constantinople smaller. That was his strategic clarity. He understood that the city's strength had always depended on connection. Connection to the Black Sea, connection to grain, to merchant networks, connection to Western aid, connection to the idea that Constantinople could endure long enough for some outside force to change the balance. Rumeli Hisara did not sever every connection at once. It did not magically starve the city overnight. But it turned movement into risk. It made every ship part of a calculation. It told the Byzantines that their geography, once their defense, could now be monitored, taxed, threatened, and closed. At the same time, Mehmed prepared the other tool that would define the siege in the imagination of later centuries: artillery. The story of the cannon founder Urban must be handled carefully. Later accounts describe him as a Hungarian master founder who offered his services first to the Byzantines and then to Mehmed when the impoverished empire could not properly pay or employ him. The broad image is powerful: a city too poor to buy the weapon that would later batter its walls. But the precise details are difficult to verify with complete certainty, and the story has the shape of a moral lesson sharpened by hindsight. What is clear is that Mehmed invested heavily in large siege guns. At Edirne, Ottoman resources could be directed toward casting artillery on a scale that frightened observers. Bronze, iron, charcoal, craftsmen, draft animals, engineers, rowers, and labor all became part of the same project. The great guns were not easy weapons. They were slow, dangerous, difficult to move, and prone to technical limits. They did not fire with modern speed. They required patience, teams, maintenance, and enormous logistical effort. That makes them more important, not less. A cannon that fires slowly still changes a siege if the attacker has time, manpower, and the will to keep using it. The old walls did not have to fall instantly. They only had to be damaged repeatedly enough to force exhausted defenders into constant repair. Mehmed's advantage was not only possession of guns. It was the state capacity to bring them, feed the men around them, protect them, and integrate them into a larger siege plan. This is where the difference between symbol and organization became visible. Constantinople possessed the most famous defensive walls in the region. Mehmed possessed the means to test them day after day. The city had inherited stone. The Sultan was assembling pressure. Inside the Ottoman court, this project was not without risk. Grand Vizier Shandali Halil Pasha is often associated with a more cautious position, wary of provoking the West or gambling too much on an uncertain siege. Whether every detail of court opposition can be reconstructed cleanly or not, the political problem was real. Mehmed had to prove that his ambition was not youthful theater. He needed victory to silence caution. That gave the coming siege a personal dimension. For Constantine, defeat meant the end of an imperial line. For Mehmed, failure would not destroy the Ottoman state. but it could damage his authority at the beginning of his reign. He was young, but youth did not mean softness. It meant he still had to establish the kind of fear and respect that older rulers inherit more easily. Constantinople became the test, not because it was strong in the way it had once been strong, but because it was still meaningful enough that taking it would transform the conqueror. A lesser city could add land. Constantinople could add legitimacy. It could turn Mehmed from one powerful Ottoman sultan into the ruler who had done what generations had imagined and failed to complete. That is why the fortress on the Bosporus mattered so much. Rumeli Hisari was preparation, threat, blockade, message, and rehearsal in stone. It showed that Mehmed would not rely on one dramatic charge against ancient walls. He would first control the approaches. He would pressure the sea. He would gather artillery. He would organize the campaign from the outside inward. In Constantinople, this must have been terrifying precisely because it was so practical. A reckless enemy can sometimes be endured. A theatrical enemy can waste himself. But Mehmed's preparations showed discipline. He was not merely dreaming of the city. He was solving the problems that had protected it. The Bosporus had been one of those problems. By the end of 1452, it was becoming part of his answer. The city still stood. Its churches still rang bells. Its markets still opened. Its defenders still believed the walls could hold if help arrived and discipline endured. But the world around Constantinople had changed shape again. The strait had a new master. The Ottoman guns were being prepared. The old capital's appeals to the West now had to cross a geography increasingly controlled by the man who intended to end it. When the final siege began in April 1453, it would look sudden to anyone watching only the movement of armies. It was not sudden. The siege had already been built into the shoreline, the fortress towers, the cannon foundries, the controlled waters, and the narrowing choices of a city that could see the danger rising and still could not stop it. Soon the pressure that had been stone on the Bosporus would become fire against the walls. By early April 1453, Constantinople could no longer pretend the danger was approaching. It had arrived. Outside the land walls, the Ottoman army began to form a world of its own. Tents spread across the fields. Horses were tethered. Fires burned at night. Tools, timber, carts, ropes, ladders, shields, powder, food, water, and men moved into position with the heavy rhythm of a state that had come prepared to stay. The siege formally began on April 6. For the defenders, that date did not feel like the start of a story. It felt like the tightening of something that had already been around their throats for years. Rumeli Hisari had restricted the Bosporus. Ottoman territory surrounded the city's wider world. Western help remained limited. The church union had divided the population. Now the pressure became visible in the most direct way possible. An army at the walls. Mehmed II positioned his forces against a city famous for making attackers suffer. He understood the reputation of the Theodosian walls. Everyone did. They had survived sieges, storms of arrows, rams, towers, hunger, fear, and generations of enemies who had discovered that Constantinople was easier to desire than to take. But Mehmed had not come with desire alone. He brought artillery. The great Ottoman guns have become almost legendary in later memory, and legend can distort as easily as it illuminates. They were not modern weapons. They did not fire quickly. They were difficult to move, dangerous to operate, and slow to reload. They could crack, overheat, misfire, and demand enormous labor for every discharge. Yet none of that made them harmless. A slow weapon can still change history if it is aimed at the same problem every day. When the guns fired, the sound moved through the body before the mind could measure it. Stone did not simply break in clean heroic fragments, it shuddered. Mortar loosened, dust rose. Men near the walls would feel the impact in their teeth and chest. The air filled with powder smoke, grit, shouting, and the strange pause after each shot when everyone waited to see what had given way. The walls could absorb damage. That had always been part of their genius. The defensive system had depth. A breach in one layer did not automatically mean the city was open. Towers, ditches, inner walls, and the labor of defenders could turn damage into delay. For a city with enough manpower and resources, delay could become survival. But Constantinople in 1453 did not have enough of anything. The garrison was small for the length of the defenses it had to hold. Estimates vary, and medieval numbers should always be handled with caution. But the basic imbalance is clear. The defenders were drastically outnumbered. They had Byzantine soldiers, foreign volunteers, Genoese and Venetian fighters, and civilians pressed into the work of survival. What they lacked was depth. The Ottoman army could rotate pressure. The defenders had to stretch. This is where Giovanni Giustiniani Longo became essential. A Genoese commander with experience in siege warfare, he arrived with men and skill at precisely the kind of defense Constantinople needed. Constantine XI placed enormous trust in him at the most threatened landward sector, around the area often associated with the St. Romanus Gate and the central land walls. Giustiniani's importance was practical. He understood that a siege is won or lost in organization as much as bravery. Men had to be placed where they mattered. Repairs had to be made before weakness became panic. A breach had to be contained before the sight of it traveled faster than orders. Courage was necessary, but courage without coordination becomes a crowd. Inside the city, the work of defense became repetitive, physical, and humiliatingly basic. The old empire that had once commanded armies across provinces now depended on people carrying earth in baskets. At night, when bombardment slowed or stopped, repair crews moved toward damaged sections of wall. Some were soldiers, some were laborers, some were civilians whose lives had been pulled into the logic of siege. They dragged beams, filled gaps, stacked barrels, shoved earth behind broken stone, and raised temporary barriers where ancient masonry had failed. A man doing that work would not think in terms of epochs. He would think about his hands. Rope burn, dust in the mouth, lime on the skin, the weight of a basket cutting into the shoulder, a voice telling him to move faster. The fear that the next shot at dawn would undo what had taken the whole night to repair. Around him, Constantinople became smaller than its name. It became a damaged section of wall. It became the sound of a shovel. It became the question of whether there would be enough men awake when the next assault came. This was Mehmed's pressure at its most effective. The cannon did not need to smash the city open in one spectacular moment. It needed to force the defenders into a cycle they could not maintain forever. Break the wall. Make them repair. Break it again. Make them repair again. Exhaust the hands. Exhaust the commanders. Exhaust the sleep. Exhaust the belief that tomorrow will be different. The walls were not being defeated only by cannonballs. They were being defeated by repetition. That was the real rhythm of the siege. The defenders could answer damage with labor. They did so again and again. They showed discipline and resilience. The idea that Constantinople simply waited helplessly for doom is false. Its people worked, fought, improvised, prayed, argued, carried, reinforced, and endured. But endurance has a cost. A soldier who fights one assault and then repairs through the night does not wake as the same soldier. A commander who must decide which weak point receives men and which must wait is not choosing between safety and danger, but between danger here and danger there. A civilian who spends night after night hearing stone break begins to understand that the city's famous walls are not immortal objects. They are a task, and the task was growing. Ottoman pressure did not come only from the guns. There were assaults, skirmishes, attempts to test weak points, and efforts to undermine or disrupt the defenses. The army outside was not a single instrument. It was a collection of pressures: artillery, infantry, engineers, naval forces, psychological force, and the knowledge that the Sultan could afford time better than the city could. Inside, Constantine XI had to hold morale together. This was not merely a matter of speeches. The famous final speeches attributed to him in later tradition must be treated carefully. History often gives doomed rulers beautiful words because later generations need endings to sound meaningful. What can be said with more confidence is that Constantine remained committed to the defense and that his presence mattered. A final emperor who abandoned the line too early would have broken more than strategy. He would have broken the story that kept men standing. But presence could not solve arithmetic. The defensive perimeter was long. The manpower was limited. The city had to watch the land walls, the sea walls, the harbor, the Golden Horn, gates, towers, weak points, and internal order. Every rumor mattered, every fire mattered, every shift in Ottoman preparation mattered. Siege turns attention into a scarce resource. Mehmed knew that as well. He did not need every attack to succeed. Failed attacks still forced defenders to respond. Bombardments that did not open a decisive breach still required repairs. Naval demonstrations that did not capture the harbor still stretched anxiety. The Ottoman camp could absorb frustration because it had reserves. The city absorbed frustration as fatigue. This difference slowly changed the meaning of time. For the Ottomans, each day was part of the plan. For Constantinople, each day survived became another day spent. Survival itself consumed the resources that made survival possible. The city's defenders understood the stakes, but they could not see the entire structure of their problem from the wall. They saw the men in front of them. They saw smoke. They heard impact. They looked for cracks. They waited for orders. They trusted that someone had counted the food, watched the harbor, placed the reserves, and read the enemy correctly. A siege forces ordinary people to trust systems they cannot inspect. That was especially painful in Constantinople, because so many systems had already failed before the Ottoman army arrived. Western aid had not come in decisive force. The old tax base had shrunk. The fleet was limited. The church union had not produced unity. The surrounding territories no longer formed a protective imperial body around the capital. Now the wall had to compensate for all of it, and no wall can compensate forever. Still, April did not begin with immediate collapse. This matters. The city held. The defenders absorbed the first shocks. Giustiniani and the land wall defense frustrated Ottoman expectations. Repairs worked often enough to keep the city alive. The old walls proved that they were not merely relics waiting to crumble at the first sound of gunpowder. For a time, the defense remained credible. That credibility mattered because every siege contains a contest over expectation. If attackers begin to believe the city will never fall, morale turns. If defenders begin to believe help will never come, the wall weakens before the stone does. In April 1453, both sides were still trying to control that invisible battlefield. Then came moments that seemed to tilt the mood. News, sightings, rumors, and prayers moved through the city. People watched the sea because the sea had always been hope. Ships could mean grain. Ships could mean soldiers. Ships could mean the West had not forgotten them. Even a small success on the water could feel larger than its military value because it answered the fear that Constantinople was alone. Outside, Mehmed could not allow hope to grow unchecked. That was one of his strengths. He understood that a siege is psychological as much as mechanical. A city that believes rescue is near will endure more. A city that sees every hope answered by a new threat begins to feel the future narrowing. So the early siege settled into a brutal pattern. Guns against stone, labor against damage, hope against evidence, commanders against exhaustion. The official beginning had been April 6, but each day after that asked the same question in a slightly harsher form. How long could an old city, thinly defended and heavily burdened by its own meaning, keep converting human endurance into temporary repairs? For now, the answer was still uncertain. The walls stood. The defenders held. The Ottoman guns kept firing, and then, for one afternoon, Constantinople saw sails on the water and allowed itself to believe that rescue might still be more than a word. For weeks, Constantinople had listened to the sound of stone being punished. Then, on April 20, the city looked toward the water. The sea had always been more than scenery for Constantinople. It was movement, food, rumor, trade, rescue, escape, and danger. The land walls faced the Ottoman army directly, but the water still carried an older kind of hope. If ships could break through, then the city was not completely alone. If ships could enter the Golden Horn, then perhaps the West had not abandoned the last Roman capital entirely. That afternoon, hope took the shape of sails. A small group of Christian ships approached the city. The exact composition is described differently in the sources, but the broad event is clear. A few vessels carrying supplies and men fought their way past the Ottoman fleet and reached Constantinople. Against the scale of Mehmed's army, it was not a massive relief force. It was not the crusade the city needed. It was not enough to reverse the siege. But inside a besieged city, scale is not measured only by military arithmetic. A ship can be small and still change the air. From the walls and the harbor, people watched the struggle unfold. Ottoman vessels tried to stop the incoming ships. The defenders saw masts, oars, waves, smoke, shouting, and movement on the water that could not be controlled from the walls. For people who had spent weeks hearing the cannon, the sea battle offered something different, action that moved toward them rather than against them. A woman standing near the harbor would not have needed to understand every maneuver. She would have heard the voices before she knew the outcome. Men shouting from towers. Someone calling that the ships were still moving. Someone else praying aloud. The smell of salt water mixed with smoke and crowded bodies. Children pressed toward adults. A soldier off duty turned his head and forgot, for a moment, the broken masonry behind him. Then the ships broke through. The Golden Horn received them like proof that the world outside had not fully disappeared. For Constantinople, this was a powerful emotional moment. It told the defenders that the Ottoman fleet was not invincible. It told civilians that rescue, however limited, could still arrive. It told Constantine XI that the city's resistance had not become invisible. It told the tired men at the walls that their labor had bought time for something meaningful. In a siege, morale can matter almost as much as stone. A defender who believes help is possible stands differently from a defender who believes he is merely delaying death. The arrival of the ships did not solve Constantinople's problems, but it lifted the pressure inside the city's mind. For a brief moment, the siege felt less like a closed room. Mehmed II understood the danger of that feeling. His problem was not only that the ships had reached the city, it was that they had done so publicly. The defenders had seen it. The Ottoman army had seen it. The Sultan's own men had seen that the sea line could be challenged. In practical terms, the relief was limited. In psychological terms, it threatened to grow larger than itself. Mehmed had to answer. Not with anger alone, with a solution. The Golden Horn was protected by a heavy chain stretched across its entrance, preventing the Ottoman fleet from simply sailing in. This chain had long been part of Constantinople's maritime defense. It turned the harbor into a protected interior space, a place where ships could anchor under the city's protection and where enemy vessels could be kept outside. The chain had done its job, so Mehmed avoided the chain. On April 22nd, Ottoman ships were hauled overland from the Bosporus into the Golden Horn. The operation has become one of the most famous images of the siege. Vessels dragged across prepared ground, likely over greased timbers or rollers, moved by manpower, animals, and organization into waters the defenders had believed were protected from direct naval intrusion. The image feels almost unreal. Ships belong on water. To see them moving over land must have felt like the rules of the siege had been quietly rewritten. It was not magic. It was labor, planning, materials, terrain, and command. But to people inside the city, the result mattered more than the mechanics. Ottoman sails appeared where they should not have been. The psychological effect was severe. The Golden Horn had not been fully safe in an absolute sense. No part of the city was truly safe, but it had been one of the spaces where defenders could feel that the old system still functioned. Chain, harbor, wall, fleet, city. These belonged together in the logic of Constantinople's survival. Mehmed's maneuver broke that feeling. Now the defenders had to watch another front. Men were needed along the harbor. Attention had to be divided. The city's limited manpower became even more strained. The Ottoman presence in the Golden Horn did not instantly make the city fall, but it expanded the geography of fear. The same woman who had heard cheers on April 20th might stand near the water 2 days later and see a different scene. Not rescue ships entering under desperate applause, but enemy vessels inside a space that had felt protected. The same harbor smell, the same damp air, the same water striking stone. But the meaning had changed. Where people had looked for help, they now had to look for threat. That is what made the sequence so cruel. The relief ships had opened a window. Mehmed did not close it with a speech. He closed it by changing the map. Hope did not fail because it was false. It failed because Mehmed answered hope with engineering. That was the lesson Constantinople had to absorb. The city could still receive help, but not enough. It could still resist, but at growing cost. It could still surprise the Ottomans, but Mehmed could respond with practical imagination. The Sultan's strength lay not only in force, but in the ability to turn a setback into a new pressure before the defenders could live too long inside their relief. This did not mean the Ottoman position was effortless. The siege remained difficult. Constantinople still held. The land walls still resisted. The defenders still fought with skill. The naval maneuver into the Golden Horn was not a simple victory that ended the campaign. It was part of a larger pattern, one more way to force the city to spend attention, labor, and morale faster than it could restore them. That is why April 20s and April 22 belong together. One day showed that Constantinople was not completely abandoned. The other showed that the city's enemies could adapt faster than its friends could rescue it. The gap between those two truths defined the final weeks of the siege. Inside the walls, people still prayed. Repairs continued. Giustiniani and the defenders still focused on the damaged landward sectors. Constantine XI still had to hold together Greeks, Italians, clergy, soldiers, civilians, unionists, anti-unionists, and exhausted men whose world was shrinking street by street. But after the Ottoman ships entered the Golden Horn, the emotional atmosphere changed. The city could no longer imagine the harbor as simply a protected rear. The sea, like the land, had become contested. The old defensive geography that had once made Constantinople so difficult to capture was being turned piece by piece into a set of problems the defenders did not have enough men to answer comfortably. A siege works by making the possible feel smaller. At the start, a city imagines many futures. Reinforcements may come. The enemy may withdraw. Disease may strike the camp. A rival power may intervene. The walls may hold. Negotiations may open. God may provide a sign. Every possibility becomes a small room where fear can rest for a while. Mehmed's strategy kept closing those rooms. The Bosporus had been narrowed by fortress guns. The land walls were being battered by artillery. The harbor had been entered by ships dragged over land. Western rescue had proven real enough to be seen, but too limited to change the structure of the siege. By late April, Constantinople remained alive. That matters. It was not yet defeated. Its defenders had not broken. The Ottomans had not yet forced the decisive breach. But the city was being taught, again and again, that survival would require more than isolated moments of success. It would require a reversal large enough to change the whole balance. No such reversal came. The ships that reached the city on April 20th gave Constantinople a reason to cheer. The ships that entered the Golden Horn on April 22nd gave it a reason to look over its shoulder. Between those two images, rescue on the water, enemy sails inside the harbor, the siege entered a darker stage. After that, the defenders no longer waited only for victory. By the end of May, Constantinople no longer needed anyone to explain what was coming. The city could feel it. Not as a prophecy, not as a clean certainty, more like pressure in the air before a storm, except this storm had been assembled by men, animals, powder, timber, metal, orders, ambition, and weeks of disciplined violence. The walls still stood, but they no longer carried the old confidence. The harbor was no longer psychologically safe. The defenders were still fighting. But the siege had entered the stage where endurance begins to feel less like resistance and more like spending the last reserves of the body. May 28, 1453, was the final full day before the assault. Outside the walls, Mehmed II prepared for the attack that would decide whether weeks of pressure became conquest or failure. The Ottoman camp had lived through frustration, losses, technical difficulty, and delay. The guns had battered the walls. Ships had entered the Golden Horn. Assaults had tested the defenses. Now the Sultan needed concentration. A siege can exhaust the attacker as well as the defender, and an army that waits too long can lose momentum. Mehmed had to turn pressure into a final act. Inside Constantinople, the defenders prepared as men prepare when the mind knows more than the mouth wants to say. Weapons were checked. Damaged armor was adjusted. Men moved toward posts they had learned through exhaustion. Officers counted what could still be counted. The walls were inspected again, though inspection could no longer offer comfort. The weak places were known. The threatened sectors were known. The missing strength was known. There are moments when a city becomes very aware of its own sounds. Footsteps in narrow streets. The creak of a door. Low voices near a church entrance. The distant movement of the enemy camp beyond stone. For weeks, cannon fire had imposed its rhythm on Constantinople. On the last night, silence itself became part of the pressure. Not true silence. No besieged city is truly silent. But the kind of pause that makes every smaller sound feel exposed. The pause before men who have been struck for weeks understand that the next blow may not be part of a pattern. It may be the decision. Hagia Sophia stood at the center of that night's memory. The great church had seen coronations, councils, triumphs, riots, processions, fear and imperial theater across centuries. Its dome had made generations look upward and feel that stone could be made to imitate heaven. But on the night before the final assault, Hagia Sophia was not only architecture. It was a refuge for meaning when military options had narrowed. Accounts describe prayers and a final religious gathering in the city. The details should not be embroidered beyond what the evidence allows, but the broad image is historically and emotionally true. People sought sacred order while political order stood near ruin. In candlelight, the city tried to gather itself. The divisions over church union had not vanished. The wounds between Greek and Latin Christianity had not been healed simply because the Ottomans were outside the walls. Many still distrusted the union with Rome. Many still feared Latin authority almost as much as Ottoman rule. But in the face of the final assault, the practical difference between theological factions grew smaller for those who had to survive the night. A man can argue about doctrine in daylight. Before a dawn attack, he may simply pray. Imagine a soldier standing near the edge of that religious atmosphere, not necessarily in the center of the ceremony, not a great commander, not a chronicler, just one of the men who must return to the walls. His armor is worn and poorly cleaned because there has been no proper time for such things. His hands smell of iron, leather, sweat, and smoke. He hears chanting or prayer from within a sacred space, and beyond that, in his memory if not in his ear, the deeper rhythm of Ottoman drums. He does not need to know the future. His body knows enough. The city is asking him to stand again. For Constantine XI, the night carried a burden that no ceremony could remove. He was emperor, but the role had narrowed around him. Earlier emperors had commanded resources across provinces, armies, fleets, and administrators. Constantine commanded a besieged capital and a coalition of men who knew the odds. His authority mattered because symbols matter in crisis, but the material gap remained. He had to be seen holding the line. This was not theatrical. In a city under siege, a ruler's presence becomes part of morale. If Constantine appeared uncertain, the uncertainty would spread. If he seemed ready to flee, the defense might unravel before the enemy reached the breach. He had to embody continuity, even when continuity had become almost impossible to guarantee. That was the final cruelty of his position. The emperor had to represent an empire that could no longer fully support him. Mehmed's burden was different. The young sultan had invested prestige, resources, and political will in the siege. He had built Rumeli Hisari, gathered artillery, moved ships into the Golden Horn, and maintained pressure for weeks. His army expected decision. His critics, whether cautious officials or nervous factions, could not be allowed to define the campaign as reckless failure. A final assault was not only military logic, it was political necessity. Both rulers faced the morning as a test of authority, but they faced it from opposite sides of history. One was trying to complete a conquest that would enlarge his future. The other was trying to prevent the past from losing its last physical center. Inside the city, ordinary people had no such grand language available. Families sheltered where they could. Some carried valuables or icons. Some likely remained close to churches. Some waited in houses where every sound from the walls traveled through imagination before it reached the ear. The fear of sack was not abstract. Medieval siege warfare carried terrifying expectations: looting, captivity, violence, separation, humiliation, and the sudden collapse of every boundary that made private life feel protected. A locked door means little if the city falls. That knowledge changes the way a household breathes. Children could be hushed without understanding why adults kept looking toward the street. Old people could remember earlier dangers and know this one felt different. Merchants could think of stored goods that might become plunder. Clergy could think of altars. Mothers could think only of keeping bodies close in the dark. The night before a city falls is not made only of soldiers. It is made of people waiting for the public world to break into the private one. This was the human meaning of the siege's final stage. The wall was not only a military structure. It was the border between ordered life and the unknown. As long as it held, a family could still imagine tomorrow in recognizable terms. Bread might be scarce, fear might be constant. But streets, churches, homes, names, and routines still belonged to the same world. If the wall broke, all of that became negotiable by force. That is why the final prayers mattered. Not because prayer could replace soldiers, and not because everyone inside the city agreed on every theological question. The prayers mattered because they gave form to fear. They allowed a city under impossible pressure to stand for a few hours inside a rhythm older than the siege. Chant, candle, incense, stone, breath. These things could not stop artillery, but they could tell frightened people that they had not yet become only victims of artillery. On the last night, faith did not make Constantinople safe. It made fear bearable. That was all it could do. And sometimes all is not little. The men who returned from prayer to the walls did not carry certainty with them. They carried exhaustion, loyalty, habit, pride, fear, and whatever strength could still be gathered from the idea that their city was worth standing for. Greeks and Latins, who might have distrusted one another in church politics, still had to face the same Ottoman attack. The argument over union did not disappear, but the wall imposed a harsher unity. At the threatened sectors, the preparations continued. The St. Romanus area and central land walls had suffered heavily. Repairs could only do so much. The defenders knew the weak points. Giustiniani and his men remained central to the defense. Constantine stayed committed to the line. Orders moved through darkness. Men took positions. The city's final military structure assembled itself out of too few parts. Outside, the Ottoman camp also prepared. The army was not a shapeless mass. Different groups had different roles: irregulars, Anatolian troops, Rumelian troops, elite janissaries, artillery crews, commanders, engineers, and naval elements all belonged to the larger operation. The final assault would depend on sequence, pressure, and the ability to keep men moving into danger after those before them fell or withdrew. This is another reason not to reduce 1453 to cannon alone. The cannon damaged the walls, but walls are taken by men. Men must advance through fear, smoke, ditches, rubble, noise, arrows, bolts, stones, blades, fire, and confusion. Mehmed's preparation had created the conditions. The final assault still required bodies to enter the space where those conditions became death. No one on either side could guarantee what would happen before dawn. That uncertainty matters. Later history makes the fall feel inevitable because later history knows the result. But on the night of May 28, the men inside the city did not live inside a completed narrative. They lived inside hours. A wall might hold. An attack might fail. A commander might rally men at the right point. A rumor might spread too fast. A gate might be contested. A wound might change morale. A single sector might become the place where the whole story turns. The future was still hidden, but it was very close. The last night of Constantinople should not be imagined as pure despair. Despair is too simple. There was fear, yes, there was exhaustion. There was probably anger, resentment, confusion, and grief. But there was also routine. Men still checked weapons. Priests still prayed. Guards still watched. Workers still moved. Leaders still gave orders. Even at the edge of catastrophe, human beings continue to do the next required thing. That may be the most grounded detail of all. A world can be ending, and someone still has to carry water. As the night deepened, Constantinople stood between two forms of preparation. Inside, prayer, repair, positioning, waiting. Outside, command, movement, assault formations, the final arrangement of force. The city's lights burned under the dome and in smaller churches. The Ottoman camp held its own forms of order under the dark. Neither side was sleeping easily. When dawn came, the siege would no longer be a test of endurance. It would become a test of rupture. Prayer would give way to metal, and the old walls, battered for weeks and held by men with almost nothing left to spend, would have to answer one final question: whether a city can survive the moment when exhaustion and assault arrive together. Before dawn on May 29, 1453, the Ottoman assault began to move, not as one clean wave, not as a single heroic charge that later painters could easily arrange into order. It came in: pressure, noise, bodies, commands, fear, smoke, and the terrible confusion that belongs to battles fought before sunrise. Men advanced toward defenses that had been battered for weeks. The ground before the land walls was no longer an abstract military space. It was torn by bombardment, crowded with obstacles marked by death, and watched by defenders who had reached the edge of what exhaustion could still obey. Mehmed II had prepared for this moment carefully. The final assault was not merely a burst of impatience. It was the result of weeks of artillery fire, probing attacks, naval pressure, psychological strain, and the widening of Constantinople's defensive burden. The defenders had been forced to repair, watch, move, and respond without the depth a larger state could have provided. Now the Sultan concentrated the siege into one decisive morning. The attack pressed especially hard against the damaged landward defences, including the sector near the St. Romanus Gate, where the walls had suffered heavily and where Giovanni Giustiniani Longo had played a central role in organizing the defense. The defenders knew this area mattered. So did the Ottomans. In the darkness and half-light, the difference between strategy and survival narrowed. A commander could arrange men before the assault. He could prepare reserves. He could reinforce weak points. He could issue orders, assign posts, and judge where the enemy was likely to press. But once bodies met rubble and smoke, order became harder to preserve. A defender at a broken section of wall might not have seen a battlefield in the way a map shows it. He would see fragments. A ladder pushed forward, a shield lifted, sparks from impact, a man falling where someone else had just stood, dust in the mouth, a shouted order that vanished beneath another sound. Greek, Latin, Turkish, and other voices colliding until language itself became part of the confusion. He might not know whether the line 20 paces away still held. That was the terror. Not only the enemy in front of him, but the uncertainty beside him. Medieval siege assaults did not require every defender to be defeated at once. They required a local break that could become visible, then contagious. A breach is physical at first. Damaged stone, a gap, a place where men can enter. But quickly it becomes psychological. If enough defenders believe the line is failing, the failure spreads faster than orders can repair it. The Ottomans understood this without needing modern language for it. Their assault unfolded in stages, with different forces committed under brutal conditions. Early attackers absorbed danger and forced the defenders to spend strength. More disciplined and elite troops could then press against men already worn down. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, became central to the final phase of the attack. This does not mean the outcome was effortless. Men still had to climb, push, fight, and die in close quarters. The walls did not surrender because history had decided they should. The defenders resisted. The city's fall should not be imagined as a simple collapse under the first impact of Ottoman force. Constantinople fought for its final morning, but the accumulated pressure had changed the conditions of that fight. Giustiniani's role now became painfully important. During the final assault, he was wounded. The exact nature and moment of the wound are described differently in sources, but its effect is clear enough. His withdrawal from the front damaged morale at the most dangerous point. In a defense stretched thin, the loss of a trusted commander could feel larger than the loss of many individual men. A city under siege depends on belief in command. When defenders saw or heard that Giustiniani had been wounded and was leaving the line, fear could travel with the news. Some may have understood the wound as serious. Others may have read the movement as a sign that the defense was failing. In battle, interpretation can be as dangerous as fact. Constantine XI reportedly tried to keep the defense together. Here, caution is necessary. Later tradition gives the last emperor dramatic final words and scenes worthy of tragedy. Some may preserve echoes of real memory. Others may have been shaped by the needs of legend. What can be said with confidence is that Constantine did not survive the fall of the city, and that his death became inseparable from the myth of the last Roman emperor. The body was never securely identified in a way that ends all doubt. That uncertainty gave memory room to grow. But on the morning itself, there was no myth yet. There was only danger moving inward. Some accounts mention the Cercoporta, a small gate said to have been left open or used in a way that allowed Ottoman soldiers to enter. Historians still debate the reliability and importance of this story. It should not be treated as the simple explanation for the fall. Constantinople did not fall because of one convenient forgotten door. By the final assault, the city was already under overwhelming pressure at damaged sectors of the wall, and the broader defensive system was near rupture. The desire for one cause is understandable. A gate is easier to imagine than decades of decline. But history is rarely so generous. The breach happened because physical damage, exhausted manpower, command disruption, Ottoman persistence, artillery pressure, and the lack of decisive relief converged in one violent morning. The city did not fall because one wall broke. One wall broke because everything behind it had been spent. That was the meaning of the breach. Once Ottoman troops entered in force, the defense could not easily restore itself. The walls had been the boundary between siege and catastrophe. When that boundary failed, the battle changed character. It was no longer only about holding an external line. It became about movement through streets, gates, towers, panic, rumor, pursuit, and the sudden knowledge that the protected interior was no longer protected. For civilians, this was the moment every fear became practical. A family sheltering indoors might hear the change before understanding it. The sound from the walls would alter. Not just impact from outside, but shouting inside the city's own space. Feet in the street, doors struck. People running without clear direction. Bells, cries, orders, and rumors crossing one another faster than anyone could verify them. The public world had broken into the private one. A locked chest, a hidden icon, a doorway barred with furniture, a child held too tightly. These small things became the last defenses of people who had no role in imperial policy, no seat at the Council of Florence, no voice in Ottoman strategy, and no power over whether Venice, Genoa, Rome, or Hungary had done enough. This is the part of conquest that grand strategy can obscure. A capital falls in chronicles, a home falls in footsteps. The Ottoman troops moved through a city that had carried centuries of meaning. For the attackers, victory meant reward, glory, survival, obedience to command, and participations in a conquest that would define Mehmed's reign. For the defenders and civilians, it meant rupture. The familiar city became dangerous from within. Hagia Sophia, which had held prayer the night before, now stood as one of the central spaces in the city's final transformation. Many people sought refuge in churches. The old belief that sacred space might offer protection met the brutal reality of conquest. The exact experiences varied across the city, and sources carried different perspectives. But the broader human cost was severe. Looting, captivity, fear, separation, and the collapse of Byzantine public authority. For Mehmed, the victory was immense. But even victory had to be managed. A conquered city is not useful only as wreckage. Constantinople was too valuable to be merely destroyed. Its capture gave Mehmed what he wanted most. Not just territory, but an imperial center. The same city that had embarrassed Ottoman geography by remaining unconquered could now become the proof of Ottoman destiny. That transformation would come after the fighting. On the morning of May 29, however, the first fact was simpler and harsher. Byzantine Constantinople had fallen. Constantine XI was gone. Giustiniani had been carried away wounded. The defenders' line had broken. Ottoman soldiers were inside the city. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had survived in changing forms for more than 1,000 years after Constantine founded his new capital, had reached its final political moment. And still, even here, we should be careful with the phrase, the end. The end of the state was not the end of the city. The fall of Byzantine rule was not the disappearance of its people, churches, language, memories, habits, or wounds. The conquest destroyed one order and opened another. The stones remained. The harbor remained. The Bosporus remained. Hagia Sophia remained. But their meanings began to change under new power. That is why the breach is so important. It was not only a military opening in a wall. It was the passage through which one world entered the ruins of another and began rewriting the city from inside. For the men still fighting, none of that could be seen clearly. They were too close to smoke, fear, wounds, and survival. Later historians would arrange causes. Later empires would use the memory. Later centuries would decide that 1453 marked the death of the Middle Ages, the end of Rome, the rise of Ottoman greatness, or the closing of a 1,000-year chapter. But in the breach itself, history had no clean labels. It had dust. It had shouting. It had a city whose defenses had finally stopped holding back the future. When the fighting moved inward, Constantinople's story changed from strategy to aftermath. The question was no longer whether the city would fall. It had fallen. The question now was what Mehmed would do with the prize. What would happen to the people trapped inside it, and how a conquered Christian capital would become the heart of an Ottoman imperial world. When the walls failed, Constantinople did not become silent. It became exposed. The boundary that had separated siege from life had been broken. For weeks, danger had stood outside the city in the form of cannon, ladders, camps, and soldiers beyond the walls. Now danger moved through streets, courtyards, houses, workshops, and warehouses. The war was no longer something people heard from a distance. It entered the spaces where they had slept, stored food, hidden valuables, prayed, argued, and waited. This is the part of a conquest that maps cannot show. A map can mark the city as taken. A chronicle can record the date. A later historian can explain the strategy. But for the people inside Constantinople on May 29, 1453, the fall arrived as bodies moving through familiar streets with unfamiliar power. Doors mattered, stairs mattered, a chest under a bed mattered, the route to a church mattered. The fear of captivity was not theoretical. In the conventions of medieval warfare, a city taken by storm could suffer looting, enslavement, seizure of property, violence, and the collapse of ordinary protections. The defenders had known this. The civilians had known it. That knowledge had been part of the terror on the final night. Now it was no longer anticipation. In houses across the city, people had to make decisions too quickly to be called strategy. Hide or run. Stay together or scatter. Carry an icon or carry bread. Protect a child or protect a parent. Remain near a church because sacred space still felt like a refuge. Or avoid crowds because crowds could become traps. A woman stepping through a narrow street might see broken household objects underfoot. A cracked bowl, cloth dragged into mud, a door hanging wrong on its hinge. The air would hold smoke, dust, sweat, fear, and the sour smell of too many bodies moving without order. Somewhere, metal struck wood. Somewhere else a voice called a name that did not answer. For her, the Byzantine Empire was not ending in an elegant sentence. It was ending in the loss of a safe doorway. Many people sought refuge in churches, and Hagia Sophia stood at the center of the city's emotional geography. The great church had been the setting of imperial ceremony, theological drama, public prayer, and the last attempt to gather meaning before the assault. Now it became part of the conquest itself. Later accounts describe crowds inside Hagia Sophia and Ottoman soldiers entering after the city fell. As always with dramatic medieval sources, details must be treated with care. But the larger fact is clear. The spiritual heart of Byzantine Constantinople passed into Ottoman hands, and its meaning was transformed. For Christians inside the city, this was devastating. Hagia Sophia was not simply a large building. It carried the memory of Justinian, the craft of architects and laborers, the rhythm of liturgy, the authority of emperors, the echo of councils, the labor of priests, mosaics, marble, lamps, incense, and centuries of people who had looked upward beneath its dome and felt that the city still stood inside a sacred order. Mehmed understood the importance of that space. His conquest would have been incomplete if it had remained only military. Taking Constantinople gave him territory. Taking its symbols gave him authority. The city had to be made to speak a new political language, and Hagia Sophia was one of the loudest voices in the old one. Soon after the conquest, Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. This was not a random act of destruction. It was an act of possession, transformation, and imperial messaging. The building remained, but its public religious role changed. The prayers changed. The ruler who claimed the city changed. The architecture that had once helped make Byzantine power feel eternal was now drawn into the Ottoman order. That was one of Mehmed's great insights. A city like Constantinople should not be merely consumed. It should be inherited. He entered not as a raider looking only to strip value and leave, but as a ruler who intended to make the city useful to his future. This does not soften the violence of conquest. The human cost was real. Looting, captivity, fear, and loss marked the fall. Families were separated. Wealth was taken. Public authority collapsed. Churches and homes were violated. But after the first violence came a different task: ruling the prize. Mehmed needed Constantinople to become more than a battlefield. He needed it to become a capital. That meant order had to return, though under new command. Streets had to function. Markets had to reopen. Buildings had to be assigned, protected, repaired, or repurposed. Populations had to be managed. Religious communities had to be organized under Ottoman authority. Empty spaces had to be filled. The city that had shrunk under late Byzantine poverty and siege needed people, trade, administration, and imperial attention. Conquest had broken Byzantine rule. Administration would build Ottoman rule on top of it. Constantinople did not vanish after 1453. It was rewritten by the power that had captured it. That is the difference between destruction and transformation. The Ottoman victory ended the Byzantine state, but it did not erase the city's strategic logic. The Bosporus still mattered, the Golden Horn still mattered, the sea routes still mattered. The location that Constantine the Great had chosen in 330 remained extraordinary. Mehmed did not need to invent that importance. He needed to control it and redirect it. In this sense, the conquest was both an ending and an acquisition. For the Byzantines, it was the end of imperial sovereignty. For Mehmed, It was the beginning of a new imperial stage. He could now claim a city that had served Roman emperors for more than 1,000 years. He could present himself not simply as a frontier conqueror, but as a ruler of a universal capital. The conquest allowed Ottoman power to wrap itself in the prestige of the very city it had defeated. That made 1453 more than a military success. It was a symbolic transfer. A young sultan gained an ancient capital. A Christian imperial city became the center of a Muslim imperial future. The ruins of one order became the foundation of another. None of this happened cleanly, and none of it erased the grief of those who suffered the transition. But it explains why Mehmed treated the city as something to possess, not simply something to punish. The name Constantinople would continue to live in many languages and memories. The city would increasingly become known to the Ottoman world as Istanbul in later usage, though names shifted over time and did not change all at once. What changed immediately was authority. The imperial palace was no longer Byzantine. The public religious center was no longer orthodox in its old role. The city's future would now be tied to Ottoman administration, Islamic rule, and the ambitions of a dynasty that had just moved from conquest to world empire. For survivors, those large transformations could feel distant from immediate loss. A person who had lost family, home, freedom, or property did not experience imperial transition as an elegant historical category. He experienced it as absence, a missing face, a door broken, a shop emptied, a church altered, a language of command that had changed in the street. That human reality must remain inside the story, because the fall of Constantinople is often told from above. Constantine dies, Mehmed enters, Hagia Sophia changes, the Middle Ages end. Those things matter, but below them were thousands of smaller endings, each one invisible unless the camera lowers itself from the dome and follows the streets. The Ottoman conquerors also had their own human world. Soldiers expected reward. Officers expected recognition. Administrators expected orders. Religious authorities had to help frame the victory. Craftsmen, builders, merchants, migrants, and officials would all become part of the city's next life. The conquest did not freeze the city in the moment of violence. It began a long process of repopulation, rebuilding, organization, and imperial reinvention. Mehmed's later reputation as the conqueror depended not only on taking Constantinople, but on making the conquest durable. A city can be seized in one day. It cannot be made into a capital in one day. That work would take policy, settlement, patronage, construction, coercion, and time. Ottoman Constantinople would become a place where older Byzantine structures, new Islamic institutions, commercial networks, imperial ambitions, and diverse communities existed under a changed political order. But on May 29, the immediate atmosphere was not yet one of stability. It was rupture. The old authorities were gone or powerless. Constantine XI was dead. Lucas Notaras and other surviving elites faced the dangerous uncertainties of conquest. Clergy had to confront a religious world transformed overnight. Foreign communities, including Genoese and Venetian interests, had to calculate their futures under the new ruler. Ordinary people had to survive first and understand later. The city's stones remained where they were. That may be the strangest part. After so much fear, the walls still cast shadows. The streets still turned where they had turned before. The water still moved through the Bosporus. The Golden Horn still reflected light. Hagia Sophia still rose over the city. physical continuity can make political catastrophe feel even more disorienting, because the world looks present while its meaning has changed. The conqueror understood this better than most. Mehmed could stand inside the captured city and see what others had seen for centuries: the value of its position, the authority of its monuments, the magnetism of its name. But he could also see what the last Byzantine rulers had lacked: the power to make that value serve a rising state. The city had passed from memory into possession, and possession brought a new question. If Constantinople had fallen, what exactly had ended? A dynasty, a state, a religious order, a 1,000-year Roman claim, or something broader that later generations would call the Middle Ages? The answer was not simple. The people of 1453 did not wake up inside a new historical period with a label attached to the morning. They lived through conquest, grief, opportunity, fear, and adaptation. The idea that the Middle Ages died in a single day is a later frame, powerful because it gives one date to a much larger transformation. Still, the date holds. It holds because the fall of Constantinople gathered so many endings into one image: the last emperor, the ancient walls, the great church, the Ottoman guns, the city at the crossing of continents, and the transfer of one imperial center into another world's hands. The Roman Empire in the east was gone. The city remained, and from that tension, absence and survival in the same streets, the memory of 1453 would grow into something larger than the siege itself. A date can become heavier than the day itself. 1453 is one of those dates. It sits in history with unusual force. The year Constantinople fell, the year the Byzantine Empire ended, the year Mehmed II took the city of Constantine, the year an ancient Christian capital became the center of an Ottoman imperial future. Later generations would look back and place even more weight on it. They would call it the end of the Middle Ages, the last breath of Rome, the beginning of a new world shaped by gunpowder, oceanic expansion, Renaissance learning, and Ottoman power. But the people who lived through May 29 did not experience it as a neat boundary between historical periods. They experienced conquest, they experienced loss, they experienced survival under a new ruler. The idea that the Middle Ages died in one day is not literally true. Ages do not end like doors closing. Medieval institutions, beliefs, economies, wars, and social structures continued long after 1453. In many places, the rhythms of life changed slowly. Peasants still planted fields, nobles still fought over land, kings still bargained with churches, merchants still measured risk by weather, pirates, taxes, and war. Yet the phrase survives because 1453 gathered too many symbols into one event to be ignored. The last Roman emperor was gone. The old eastern capital had fallen. The great walls had been broken by a campaign that made gunpowder artillery feel like a sign of the future. Hagia Sophia had changed its public religious meaning. The Ottoman state now possessed the city that had haunted its geography and imagination. This is why the fall of Constantinople became more than the end of a siege. It became a story later centuries could use to explain transition. For the West, it could stand as a warning that Christendom had failed to defend one of its greatest cities. For the Ottomans, it became a foundation myth of imperial greatness. For Orthodox Christians, it became a wound and a memory of loss. For historians, it became one of the most dramatic markers between medieval and early modern worlds. Mehmed understood the power of what he had taken. He was not content to let Constantinople remain a ruined trophy. A shattered city could inspire fear, but a restored capital could project authority. The young sultan needed the city to live again under his rule. He needed its harbors, walls, churches, markets, workshops, populations, and symbolic gravity to serve the Ottoman future. That required more than conquest. It required settlement, administration, rebuilding, religious reorganization, patronage, and the careful transformation of space. The city had to be repopulated. Its economy had to be revived. Its institutions had to be fitted into an Ottoman framework. Its old prestige had to be redirected without being completely erased, because the value of Constantinople lay partly in the fact that everyone already knew it mattered. Mehmed became known as Fatih, the conqueror. But conquest was only the first part of his project. To rule Constantinople was to claim continuity and replacement at the same time. He could present himself as the master of a city once ruled by Roman emperors, while also making it the seat of a Muslim dynasty whose ambitions reached across Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean. The city's past became useful because it made the new order feel larger. This is one of the strange afterlives of imperial power. A conqueror often destroys the state he defeats, then borrows its symbols to strengthen his own. Mehmed did not need Byzantine sovereignty to survive. He needed Byzantine prestige to become Ottoman property. The walls, the harbor, the palaces, the great church, the very name of the city. All of these could be made to speak differently under new authority. For the Byzantines, the loss was final at the level of statehood. There would be no restored Eastern Roman Empire. No emperor would return to the palace and rebuild the old system. No future council, marriage alliance, or Western crusade would reverse the fact that Constantinople had become Ottoman. The political line that stretched from Constantine the Great to Constantine XI had ended. But memory did not obey the same rules as territory. Greek-speaking communities, Orthodox traditions, manuscripts, liturgical habits, imperial myths, and stories of the last emperor continued to live in different forms. Some scholars moved westward before and after the fall, contributing in various ways to the circulation of Greek learning in Renaissance Italy. Though this process was broader than any single event, churches adapted, families survived, communities negotiated their place under Ottoman rule. The empire ended, but its cultural remains entered other histories. That is why the legacy of 1453 cannot be reduced to a simple tragedy. It was a tragedy for the Byzantine state and for many people caught in the conquest. It was a triumph for Mehmed and the Ottoman dynasty. It was a shock to Western Christendom. It was a transformation of Mediterranean politics. It was also a reminder that cities can outlive the powers that claim them, while carrying the scars of each claim into the next age. The fall changed the balance of fear. After 1453, Ottoman power stood more visibly at the center of Eastern Mediterranean politics. Constantinople, now an Ottoman capital, gave the dynasty a prestige and strategic position no other city could offer in quite the same way. It connected imperial ambition to geography. The Bosporus, the Black Sea, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Aegean, and beyond. The old city of Constantine became the heart of a different empire. That is why the title, "The Day the Middle Ages Died," works as drama, even if it must be handled carefully as history. The Middle Ages did not die everywhere on May 29, 1453. But something deeply medieval did end there. the idea that the Roman imperial past still possessed a living Eastern capital under Christian emperors. The city that had made continuity visible had changed hands. 1453 did not end the Middle Ages in one day. It gave the world an image powerful enough to make one day feel like an ending. That is the honest meaning of the phrase. The cannon mattered because it seemed to announce a new logic of war. The walls mattered because they represented an older confidence in stone, height, and endurance. Constantine XI mattered because he gave the story its final human face. Mehmed mattered because he turned victory into statecraft. Hagia Sophia mattered because buildings can carry the emotional weight of entire civilization. Together, they made 1453 unforgettable. And yet, if we return to the beginning of this story, the answer to the central question becomes clearer. How did the greatest city in Christendom finally fall? It fell because greatness had become separated from the systems that once sustained it. Constantinople had geography, but the Ottomans learned to control the geography around it. It had walls, but the walls needed manpower and repair. It had religious prestige, but church union divided the people it needed to unite. It had Western sympathy, but not enough Western force. It had history, but history could not replace tax revenue, soldiers, ships, and strategic depth. Mehmed's cannons broke stone, but they were striking a city already weakened by centuries of pressure. The loss of Anatolia, the wound of 1204, the thin restoration after 1261, the rise of Ottoman power, the failure of decisive rescue, and the narrowing of every option available to the last emperor. The final morning was dramatic because endings usually are. The deeper story is that the ending had been prepared for a very long time. When Constantine XI disappeared in the fighting, he became more than a defeated ruler. He became a symbol of a vanished order, brave, trapped, burdened by inheritance, and forced to defend a world with too few means left to defend it. When Mehmed entered the city, he became more than a victorious sultan. He became the ruler who transformed the dream of conquest into possession. Between those two figures stood Constantinople itself. Not dead, changed. Its streets would fill again. Its markets would reopen. Its skyline would remain one of the most powerful in the world. Its name would carry layers of Greek, Roman, Christian, Islamic, Ottoman, and modern memory. The city would keep living, but no longer as the capital of the empire that had built its identity around the claim that Rome still endured in the East. That claim ended in 1453, and maybe that is why the date still feels so heavy, because the fall of Constantinople reminds us that power can survive in language after it has weakened in matter. A state can keep its ceremonies after losing its provinces. A city can keep its walls after losing the world that supplied them. A ruler can keep his title after losing the army that once made the title command obedience. For a while, the gap can be hidden. Then one day, the pressure outside becomes strong enough to reveal it. If you want the next chapter in this series, tell us which medieval power should face the same kind of autopsy next. Not as legend, not as nostalgia, but as a living system of faith, money, violence, fear, and ambition. And remember the image that began this story: dust slipping from damaged walls before dawn. That dust was not only stone. It was 1,000 years of history becoming visible in the air.